The dust-laden wind howled across the barren landscape like a starving beast as Ruby Whitaker collapsed to her knees in the middle of Superior, Colorado territory. 1876. The journey had taken everything from her: her strength, her hope, and nearly her life. 3 days without food, her last morsel shared with a stray dog that followed her for miles, before disappearing into the wilderness. Now, as the merciless sun beat down upon her dirt-streaked face, Ruby's vision blurred, the weathered buildings of the mining town swimming before her eyes like mirages in a desert. Yorick Youngblood was cleaning his rifle behind the bar of the Silver Dollar Saloon when he heard the commotion outside. The establishment was empty this early in the day, save for old Pete Jenkins nursing his morning whiskey in the corner. Yorick set down the oiled rag, his calloused hands moving with practiced precision as he placed the Winchester beneath the counter. "Somebody's collapsed in the street," a voice called from outside, prompting Yorick to move toward the bat-wing doors with long, purposeful strides. The sight that greeted him sent an unexpected jolt through his chest. A young woman, thin as a rail and dressed in travel-worn clothes, lay crumpled in the dirt, her auburn hair spilling out from beneath a faded bonnet. A small crowd had gathered, but nobody moved to help her, merely gawking as if she were some curiosity in a traveling show. "Stand back," Yorick commanded, his deep voice brooking no argument as he pushed through the onlookers. He knelt beside the woman, noting the dark circles beneath her closed eyes and the hollow cheeks that spoke of prolonged hunger. "Miss," he said softly, touching her shoulder, "can you hear me?" Ruby's eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of spring moss. "Water," she whispered through cracked lips. Without hesitation, Yorick slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees, lifting her slight frame with ease. She weighed hardly more than a child, and the realization stirred something protective within him. "Get the doctor," he ordered a young boy who stood nearby, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Doc Matthews is out at the Morrison place," the boy replied. "Baby coming." Yorick frowned, adjusting his hold on the woman. "Then fetch Mrs. Henderson. Tell her to bring her remedies." As the boy scampered off, Yorick carried Ruby into the saloon, ignoring Pete Jenkins' startled expression. The old miner quickly shuffled aside as Yorick approached the table farthest from the door, placing Ruby gently on the wooden chair. "Pete, grab a glass of water and some of that stew Maggie left simmering," Yorick said, his eyes never leaving Ruby's pale face. The woman stirred, her eyelids heavy as she struggled to focus on her surroundings. The dimly lit interior of the saloon was a stark contrast to the blinding sunlight outside, and she blinked rapidly, confusion evident in her gaze. "You're safe now," Yorick assured her, his voice gentler than most would believe possible from the taciturn saloon owner. "What's your name?" "Ruby," she managed, her voice barely audible. "Ruby Whitaker." Yorick nodded, taking the glass of water Pete handed him. "I'm Yorick Youngblood. This is my establishment. Drink slowly," he advised, supporting the back of her head as he held the glass to her lips. Ruby took small sips, closing her eyes as the cool liquid soothed her parched throat. When she finished, she looked up at him with those remarkable green eyes, gratitude shining in their depths. "Thank you," she whispered. Pete returned with a bowl of steaming stew, the aroma of beef and vegetables filling the air. Ruby's stomach growled audibly, and a faint blush colored her hollow cheeks. "When's the last time you ate, Miss Whitaker?" Yorick asked, placing the bowl before her with a spoon. "3 days ago," she admitted, her hands trembling as she reached for the utensil. I've been traveling." Yorick frowned, noting how her fingers shook too violently to hold the spoon properly. Without comment, he took it from her, scooped a small amount of stew and held it to her lips. "Eat slowly," he cautioned. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Ruby accepted his help, the humiliation of being fed like a child overshadowed by the desperate hunger clawing at her insides. The rich flavors burst on her tongue, and she had to fight the urge to grab the bowl and devour its contents in one desperate gulp. The door swung open, admitting a stout woman with gray streaked hair bundled beneath a practical bonnet. Mrs. Henderson, the town's unofficial healer, approached with brisk efficiency, her shrewd eyes assessing Ruby's condition. "Found yourself another stray, Yorick?" she asked, setting down her basket of remedies. "She collapsed in the street," Yorick replied, stepping back to allow the older woman access to Ruby. Mrs. Henderson clicked her tongue sympathetically as she felt Ruby's forehead and checked her pulse. "Exhaustion and hunger, most likely. Nothing some good food and rest won't cure." She turned her attention to Ruby. "Where are you from, child?" "Philadelphia," Ruby answered, her voice a little stronger after several spoonfuls of stew. "I was traveling to Denver, but—" Her voice faltered and her eyes darted nervously to Yorick before returning to Mrs. Henderson. The older woman seemed to understand the unspoken message. "Yorick, be a dear and fetch my willow bark tea from the kitchen. I left it brewing." Once he had stepped away, Mrs. Henderson leaned closer. "Are you running from someone, dear?" Ruby nodded slightly, her fingers twisting in her lap. "My uncle. After my parents died, he tried to force me to marry his business partner, a man of 60 with 2 previous wives, both dead under suspicious circumstances." Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened. "I see. Well, Superior might be small, but we look after our own here. You rest and regain your strength. We'll figure out what's to be done." Yorick returned with the tea, his expression neutral, though Ruby suspected he had heard at least part of her explanation. He set the cup before her without comment, then moved back behind the bar, his eyes occasionally drifting in her direction as he resumed cleaning his rifle. Over the next hour, Ruby slowly consumed the stew and tea, color gradually returning to her cheeks. Mrs. Henderson eventually departed, after extracting a promise from Yorick to ensure Ruby had a proper place to sleep. "The boarding house has a spare room," he told Ruby once they were alone, Pete having shuffled off to his daily work at the mine. "Mrs. Dawson's a good sort. Won't ask too many questions." Ruby's hands tightened around her empty teacup. "I have no money," she admitted, shame coloring her voice. "It was stolen 2 days ago, along with most of my provisions." Yorick's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark blue eyes. "You can work here," he said after a moment. "The saloon needs a serving girl. Previous one ran off with a drummer passing through last month." Hope surged in Ruby's chest, quickly tempered by caution. "Work in a saloon? She hesitated, aware of what such establishments often expected of their female employees. "Just serving drinks and food," Yorick clarified, as if reading her thoughts. "Nothing more. Anyone gets improper, they answer to me." The quiet statement carried more weight than a shouted threat, and Ruby found herself believing him. "I accept," she said softly. "Thank you, Mr. Youngblood." "Yorick," he corrected, returning to his work. "Rest a while longer. I'll show you to the boarding house later." Ruby nodded, leaning back in her chair as exhaustion washed over her. Despite the unfamiliar surroundings and the uncertain future ahead, she felt safer than she had in months. As her eyelids grew heavy, her last conscious thought was of the surprising gentleness in Yorick Youngblood's weathered hands as he had carried her to his table. The following days established a routine that brought much-needed stability to Ruby's life. She took her meals at the saloon, slept in a small but clean room at Mrs. Dawson's boarding house, and began learning the rhythm of saloon work from Yorick. The first evening had been terrifying, the saloon filled with rough miners and cowboys whose hungry eyes followed her every movement. But true to his word, Yorick had been vigilant, his imposing presence and reputation ensuring that no one dared cross the invisible line he had drawn around her. By the end of her first week in Superior, Ruby had begun to recognize the regular patrons, even developing a cautious rapport with some of the more respectful ones. Old Pete Jenkins would tip his hat whenever she brought his whiskey, and Caleb Murray, the blacksmith, always thanked her politely for her service. It was during her second week that Ruby discovered Yorick's other occupation. She had risen early, unable to sleep as memories of her hasty flight from Philadelphia plagued her dreams. Deciding that a walk might clear her head, she had ventured toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scattered homesteads. The sound of gunfire brought her to a startled halt. 3 quick shots, followed by the unmistakable sound of tin cans being struck. Curiosity overcoming caution, Ruby followed the noise, coming upon a small clearing where Yorick stood, revolver in hand, facing a row of cans arranged on a fallen log. She watched, mesmerized, as he drew and fired in one fluid motion, the can at the far end flying backward as if struck by an invisible fist. The precision and speed with which he handled the weapon spoke of years of practice and possibly use. "Most folks don't go wandering alone at dawn," Yorick commented without turning, evidently aware of her presence despite her silence. Ruby stepped forward, emerging from the shadow of the pines. "I couldn't sleep." Yorick holstered his revolver, his movements deliberate and practiced. "Nightmares." "Memories," Ruby corrected, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the morning chill. "You're very good with that." A ghost of a smile touched Yorick's lips, the expression so rare that Ruby found herself staring. "Necessity breeds proficiency. Were you a lawman?" she asked, moving closer, genuinely curious about this taciturn man who had shown her unexpected kindness. "For a time," he acknowledged, beginning to collect the scattered cans. "Marshal in Kansas after the war. Decided I preferred serving drinks to serving warrants." Ruby helped him gather the remaining cans, noting the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for any sign of threat. "Is that why you're out here practicing? Old habits?" Yorick's expression turned serious. A man with a past never truly outgrows the need for vigilance. Something in his tone sent a chill down Ruby's spine, a reminder that Superior's apparent tranquility might be as fragile as her own sense of security. "You think my uncle might find me here?" The question had plagued her since her arrival, the fear that Augustus Whitaker's reach might extend even to this remote mining town. Her uncle was not a man to suffer defiance, especially when it interfered with his business arrangements. "Superior's not on many maps," Yorick replied, his gaze steady on hers, "but caution serves better than complacency." He hesitated, then added, "If trouble comes, you won't face it alone." The simple promise warmed Ruby more than she expected, and she found herself smiling at this enigmatic man who had, in just 2 short weeks, become her unexpected protector. "Thank you for the work," she said, changing the subject as they began walking back toward town. "I know I'm still learning, but you're doing fine," Yorick interrupted. "Customers like you, tips are up." Ruby laughed softly at his characteristic brevity. "I've been saving every penny. Once I have enough, I'll continue to Denver. My mother had a cousin there." Yorick's stride faltered almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing, merely nodding as they continued their walk in companionable silence. As the weeks passed, Ruby's strength returned fully, her once gaunt frame filling out with regular meals. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes upon arrival began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that Yorick couldn't help but notice. She moved through the saloon with increasing ease, handling the boisterous minors and occasional difficult customer with a firm politeness that rarely failed to diffuse potential trouble. On rare occasions, when a particularly inebriated patron became too insistent, Ruby would catch Yorick's eye across the room, and the problem would resolve itself with remarkable speed. She never saw exactly what he said to these men, but the effect was immediate and lasting. "You've got quite a reputation," Ruby observed one afternoon as they restocked the bar before opening. "That cowboy last night looked like he'd seen a ghost when you spoke to him." Yorick continued arranging bottles, his expression neutral. "Reputation's a useful tool. Is it deserved?" The question slipped out before Ruby could reconsider its wisdom. Yorick paused, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes." The simple admission hung between them, neither frightening nor reassuring, merely a fact as immutable as the mountains that surrounded Superior. Ruby nodded, accepting his answer without further questions. She had seen enough of the world to know that good men sometimes did terrible things, and terrible men occasionally performed acts of kindness. Yorick Youngblood was a complex tapestry she was only beginning to understand. That evening brought a late spring thunderstorm, the kind that rolled down from the mountains with little warning, turning the main street into a river of mud within minutes. The saloon was quieter than usual, most patrons having decided to remain at home rather than brave the downpour. Ruby was wiping down tables when the door burst open, admitting a drenched stranger whose expensive clothing marked him as out of place in the humble mining town. "Whiskey," he demanded, approaching the bar without removing his sodden hat. "Your best." Yorick poured the drink without comment, sliding it across the polished surface. The stranger tossed it back in one swallow, then slammed the glass down for a refill. His eyes, bloodshot and restless, scanned the nearly empty room, eventually settling on Ruby with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Well now," he drawled, his accent distinctly Eastern. "Superior might be more interesting than I was led to believe." Ruby kept her head down, continuing her work while trying to ignore the stranger's stare. When he approached her table, she steeled herself, summoning the professional smile she had perfected over the past month. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice betraying none of her discomfort. The man leaned closer, his breath reeking of whiskey and cigars. "That depends on what's on offer, sweetheart." "Just drinks and food," Ruby replied firmly, taking a step back. The stranger chuckled, reaching out to grasp her wrist. "Come now, don't be coy. I can make it worth your while." Before Ruby could respond, Yorick materialized beside them, his presence looming over the smaller man. "Remove your hand," he said quietly, each word distinct and precise. The stranger glanced up, irritation flashing across his features before recognition dawned in his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, releasing Ruby's wrist. "Yorick Youngblood, thought you'd be dead by now." Yorick's expression remained impassive, but his eyes had taken on a dangerous coldness that Ruby had never seen before. "Benjamin Thorne. Still bothering women who aren't interested." Thorne straightened, adjusting his wet coat with an attempt at dignity. "Still playing the gallant protector, I see. Didn't serve you well last time, as I recall." The tension between the two men was palpable, layered with a history Ruby could only guess at. Yorick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. "Your business in Superior." Thorne's lips curled into a smirk. "Just passing through, heading to Denver on business." His gaze slid back to Ruby, assessing. though I might extend my stay given the unexpected amenities. You'll find better accommodations in Idaho Springs, Yorick suggested, his tone making it clear this was not a recommendation but an instruction. For a moment, Ruby thought Thorne might challenge the implied dismissal, but after a tense silence, he merely shrugged. Perhaps you're right. Weather's turning foul anyway. He tossed several coins on the nearest table, far more than his drinks were worth. For the lady's trouble, he said with a mocking bow in Ruby's direction. Once Thorne had departed, Ruby released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You know him. Yorick moved behind the bar, pouring himself a rare drink. From Kansas. He was a land speculator, specialized in acquiring property by any means necessary. He seemed to know you well. Well enough to keep his distance, Yorick replied, downing the whiskey in one swallow. After a moment he added, be careful if you see him again. Thorne's not a man to cross. Ruby nodded, understanding the warning. As she resumed her work, she couldn't shake the feeling that Benjamin Thorne's appearance had stirred something in Yorick, awakening ghosts he had tried to leave buried. That night, as she walked back to the boarding house under Yorick's silent escort, the air between them seemed charged with unspoken tension, the comfortable rapport of recent weeks temporarily displaced by shadows from the past. The following morning brought clear skies and no sign of Benjamin Thorne, much to Ruby's relief. Life in Superior resumed its regular rhythm, though she noticed Yorick seemed more vigilant than before, his eyes frequently scanning the saloon and the street beyond with heightened alertness. As spring gave way to summer, Ruby found herself increasingly comfortable in her new life. The money she had been saving toward her journey to Denver remained untouched, her departure date constantly postponed for reasons she was reluctant to examine too closely. Mrs. Dawson had introduced her to other women in town, and Ruby had begun to develop friendships, particularly with Sarah Cooper, the schoolteacher, and Martha Jenkins, Pete's daughter-in-law. It was Martha who first commented on what was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone except perhaps Ruby and Yorick themselves. He watches you, Martha observed one afternoon as they selected fabric at the general store. Not like the miners do. Different. Ruby felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Youngblood is my employer. He's merely ensuring the customers behave appropriately. Martha's knowing smile spoke volumes. My father-in-law says Yorick hasn't taken an interest in anyone since he came to Superior 5 years ago. Not until you stumbled into town half dead. He's been kind, Ruby acknowledged, focusing intently on comparing two nearly identical bolts of calico. I owe him a great deal. Kindness isn't what makes a man escort a woman home every night for 3 months, rain or shine, Martha countered. Nor does it explain why the most taciturn man in Colorado territory suddenly has opinions on whether the saloon needs new curtains or fresh flowers on the tables. Ruby had no ready response, her mind filling with small moments she had dismissed. Yorick ensuring she ate proper meals during busy shifts, the book of poetry that had appeared mysteriously in her room at the boarding house, the way his rare smiles seemed reserved exclusively for her. That evening, as she arranged wildflowers in the cracked vase Yorick had procured from somewhere, Ruby found herself studying him with new awareness. He moved with the fluid economy of a man comfortable in his own skin, his broad shoulders and lean frame speaking of strength kept carefully in check. When he caught her watching, the look that passed between them sent an unexpected warmth curling through her body. Something wrong? He asked, mistaking her scrutiny for concern. Ruby shook her head, suddenly shy. No, I was just... She hesitated, then plunged ahead. Martha Jenkins thinks you have a particular interest in my welfare. Yorick stilled, his hands pausing in the act of restocking glasses. For a long moment he said nothing, and Ruby began to regret broaching the subject so directly. "Martha Jenkins talks too much," he finally said, though there was no anger in his tone. He met her gaze steadily. "But she's not wrong." The simple admission sent Ruby's heart racing. Before she could formulate a response, the door swung open, admitting a group of cowboys fresh from a cattle drive. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that would need to be addressed when time and privacy allowed. The opportunity came 3 days later, when a broken wheel on the supply wagon delayed the saloon's usual delivery. Yorick closed early, sending home the handful of disappointed customers with promises of free drinks the following day. Ruby was wiping down the last table when he approached, his usual confidence tempered by an uncharacteristic hesitation. "Walk with me," he asked, nodding toward the door. Ruby agreed, curious about this departure from their routine. They strolled in comfortable silence through the quiet town, eventually reaching the small creek that ran behind the church. Yorick led her to a wooden bench beneath a cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. "I was married once," he began without preamble, his gaze fixed on the flowing water. "In Kansas before I came here. Her name was Alina." Ruby listened, sensing the importance of this rare glimpse into his past. "She was killed during a land dispute. Men working for Benjamin Thorne burned our farm when I refused to sell." His voice remained steady, but Ruby could see the tension in his jaw. "I was away, serving papers on a homesteader, by the time I returned." "I'm so sorry," Ruby whispered, instinctively reaching for his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused. "I hunted them down," Yorick continued. "Every man responsible, but it didn't bring her back. Nothing did." He turned to face Ruby, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "I came to Superior to forget, never intended to care about anyone again." Ruby's heart thundered in her chest as she understood what he was telling her. "And now I find myself carrying a woman to my table, only to discover she's carried herself into my life." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You remind me there's more to living than just surviving." Ruby squeezed his hand, emotion making her voice unsteady. "When I collapsed that day, I thought my journey was ending. I never imagined it was just beginning." Yorick reached up, his fingers gentle as they brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You still plan to continue to Denver?" The question hung between them, laden with significance. Ruby looked into his eyes, seeing vulnerability beneath the strength that had first drawn her to him. "I'm finding fewer reasons to leave," she admitted softly, "and more reasons to stay." The kiss that followed was gentle, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened as months of unacknowledged attraction crystallized into something neither could deny. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Ruby felt as if she had finally found home after a lifetime of searching. Their courtship progressed, with the same quiet intensity that characterized Yorick himself. He was not a man given to grand gestures or flowery declarations, but Ruby discovered the depth of his feelings in countless small actions. The way he would touch the small of her back when they walked together. How he began teaching her to shoot, just in case. The rare but treasured moments when he would share stories of his past, gradually unfolding his life before Superior like the pages of a cherished book. Summer's heat gave way to the crisp air of autumn, the aspen trees surrounding Superior turning to gold as if touched by an alchemist's hand. Ruby had moved from the boarding house to the small room above the saloon, a practical arrangement that raised eyebrows but no serious objections in a town where people generally minded their own business. It was a Tuesday evening in late September when the past Ruby had been running from finally caught up with her. The saloon was moderately busy, filled with the usual mix of miners, cowboys, and townsfolk seeking respite from their daily labors. Ruby was serving a tray of drinks when the door opened, admitting a gust of cool air and a familiar figure that made her blood run cold. Augustus Whitaker stood in the entrance, his expensive Eastern suit and silver-tipped cane marking him as distinctly out of place. Beside him, Benjamin Thorne surveyed the room with smug satisfaction, his gaze eventually landing on Ruby's frozen form. "There she is," he announced unnecessarily, pointing a gloved finger in her direction. "Just as I told you, Mr. Whitaker." Ruby's hands trembled, the glasses on her tray clinking together as her uncle approached. At 55, Augustus Whitaker remained an imposing figure, his silver hair and neatly trimmed beard giving him the appearance of distinguished authority that had fooled so many in Philadelphia society. "Ruby," he said, his voice carrying the false warmth she remembered so well. "My dear niece, you've led us on quite a chase." The glasses slipped from Ruby's nerveless fingers, crashing to the floor in a spray of whiskey and broken crystal. The noise drew Yorick from the back room, his expression shifting from inquiry to cold anger as he took in the scene before him. "Mr. Whitaker, I presume," he said, moving to stand beside Ruby, his presence solid and reassuring against the wave of fear threatening to overwhelm her. Augustus raised an eyebrow, assessing Yorick with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to measuring the worth of others. "You have me at a disadvantage, sir. Yorick Youngblood, this is my establishment." His hand rested lightly on the small of Ruby's back, a silent promise of protection. "Then I must thank you for employing my niece during her impulsive adventure." Augustus's smile didn't reach his eyes. However, family matters now necessitate her return to Philadelphia. Ruby found her voice at last, though it emerged shakier than she would have liked. "I'm not going back, Uncle. Not now, not ever." Augustus sighed, the sound laden with practiced patience. "My dear, you're not thinking clearly. Your position in society, your inheritance, these things cannot be simply abandoned on a whim. And Mr. Hargrove has been most understanding about your temporary absence." "Mr. Hargrove can go to hell," Ruby replied with unexpected vehemence, drawing surprised looks from the saloon patrons. "As can you, Uncle. I've made a life here." Thorne chuckled, the sound oily and unpleasant. "A life, serving drinks to unwashed miners." "Come now, Miss Whitaker. Surely you can do better than this backwater town and its limitations." His gaze flicked dismissively toward Yorick. Yorick's expression remained impassive, but Ruby could feel the tension radiating from him. "Miss Whitaker has made her wishes clear," he stated quietly. "I suggest you respect them." Augustus's facade of affability slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Youngblood. Ruby is my brother's child, and until she reaches the age of 25, her affairs remain under my legal guardianship." "I'm 22, Ruby protested, "an adult capable of making my own decisions." "The law says otherwise, my dear." Augustus withdrew a folded document from his inner pocket. "I have here a court order from a Pennsylvania judge, authorizing me to return you to your rightful home and responsibilities." Yorick's eyes narrowed. "Pennsylvania law holds no jurisdiction in Colorado territory." "Perhaps not directly," Thorne interjected smoothly. "But I've taken the liberty of consulting with Judge Morrison in Denver. He's agreed to honor the Pennsylvania ruling, given the circumstances." Ruby felt the room spinning around her, the carefully constructed safety of her new life crumbling like a sandcastle before an advancing tide. "Judge Morrison," she whispered, remembering the name from her first day in Superior. The local judge, his brother, Thorne, confirmed with a satisfied smile. Family connections do prove useful, don't they? Augustus stepped closer, his voice lowering to a tone that only Ruby and Yorick could hear. You will return with me tomorrow, Ruby, quietly and without further embarrassment to the family name. Should you refuse? His gaze shifted meaningfully to Yorick. I understand that former lawmen often have complicated histories that might interest the current authorities, especially when brought to their attention by men of influence. The threat hung in the air, its implications clear. Ruby felt Yorick's hand tighten almost imperceptibly at her back, and she knew her uncle had struck a nerve. One night, Augustus continued, his voice returning to its normal volume. To say your goodbyes and gather your belongings, we depart on tomorrow's afternoon stage. With a curt nod to the room at large, he turned and exited the saloon, Thorne following with a last, triumphant glance over his shoulder. The silence that followed their departure was deafening, broken only when Yorick quietly asked the remaining customers to leave, closing the saloon early for the second time that month. Once they were alone, Ruby collapsed into the nearest chair, her legs unable to support her any longer. He'll do it, she said, her voice hollow with certainty. Whatever he's threatening you with, he'll make good on it if I don't comply. That's how he operates, finding weaknesses and exploiting them without mercy. Yorick poured 2 whiskeys, placing one before Ruby before taking the seat across from her. There are things in my past that wouldn't bear close scrutiny, he acknowledged. Men I killed as a marshal, and after when I was hunting Aliner's murderers. I can't let him destroy you, Ruby whispered, reaching for his hand. Not after everything you've done for me. I'll go back, no. The single word held such conviction that Ruby fell silent. Yorick's blue eyes burned with an intensity that made her breath catch. We'll find another way. What other way is there? She asked, desperation edging her voice. He has the law on his side, connections in high places. Even here, hundreds of miles from Philadelphia, his reach extends. Yorick was silent for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand as he considered their options. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but resolute. Marry me. Ruby stared at him, certain she had misheard. What? Marry me, Yorick repeated, more firmly this time. Tonight. Reverend Simmons owes me a favor. As your husband, I would have legal standing to contest your uncle's guardianship. But the stage leaves tomorrow afternoon. Even if we marry tonight, it wouldn't change the court order. It would give us time, Yorick countered. Time to fight through proper legal channels. Your uncle would have to petition the territorial court, which would mean weeks, possibly months of delay. Hope flickered in Ruby's chest, but uncertainty quickly followed. You would marry me just to thwart my uncle. Yorick's expression softened, and he reached across the table to cup her cheek in his calloused palm. I would marry you, because the thought of you leaving tears a hole in my chest wider than any bullet ever could. Because in the months since you stumbled into my life, you've become as essential to me as breathing. His voice roughened with emotion. I love you, Ruby Whitaker. Have for some time now, was working up the courage to ask properly, with a ring and all the words a woman deserves to hear. Your uncle just forced my hand a bit sooner than I'd planned. Tears spilled down Ruby's cheeks, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Yes, she whispered, covering his hand with hers. Yes, I'll marry you. Tonight, tomorrow, anytime. I love you, Yorick Youngblood. Their kiss was brief but filled with promise, the first pledge of many they would exchange before the night was through. Yorick rose, determination replacing the momentary vulnerability he had allowed her to glimpse. Pack what you need, he instructed, moving toward the stairs. I'll fetch the reverend and 2 witnesses who can be trusted." Ruby nodded, her mind racing ahead to the confrontation that would inevitably come with the morning light. What about tomorrow? Uncle Augustus won't simply accept defeat. Yorick paused at the bottom of the staircase, his expression grim. "One battle at a time, love. First, we make sure he can't legally force you to leave. Then we deal with whatever comes next." The wedding that took place 3 hours later in the small, candle-lit church was not the ceremony Ruby had imagined as a young girl. There were no flowers beyond the simple wildflower arrangement Yorick had insisted on procuring despite the late hour. No fine dress beyond the clean blue calico she had changed into. No gathering of friends to witness their vows. Instead, there was Reverend Simmons, bleary-eyed but willing, Pete Jenkins and Sarah Cooper as witnesses, and the man standing before her, his eyes never leaving hers as they exchanged the ancient promises that would bind them together. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Simmons declared, closing his Bible with a satisfied smile. "You may kiss your bride, Yorick." The kiss they shared was tender yet charged with the knowledge of what tomorrow might bring, a silent vow to face it together. As they signed the marriage certificate, Ruby felt a curious blend of exhilaration and fear, her new surname Youngblood seeming both foreign and exactly right as she penned it for the first time. They returned to the saloon, now truly their shared home, in the small hours of the morning. Despite the circumstances, Yorick insisted on carrying Ruby across the threshold, his arms strong and sure as he lifted her. "Never imagined I'd have cause to do this again," he admitted quietly as he set her down in their room. "Thank you for giving me a second chance at happiness." Ruby's heart swelled with love for this complicated man, who had rescued her in more ways than one. Their coming together that night was gentle yet passionate, a physical expression of the bond that had been growing between them since that first day when he had carried her, half-conscious, to his table. Morning arrived too quickly, the golden light filtering through the curtains finding them wrapped in each other's arms, momentarily at peace despite the storm they knew was coming. They dressed in silence, each lost in thought, preparing for the confrontation that couldn't be avoided. They didn't have to wait long. Augustus Whitaker arrived at the saloon shortly after 10, Benjamin Thorne once again at his side. The older man's confidence faltered visibly when he found not only Ruby waiting for him but Yorick, Pete Jenkins, Reverend Simmons, and Sheriff Davis, the latter having been briefed on the situation early that morning. "Good morning, Uncle," Ruby greeted him, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I believe you've met my husband, Yorick Youngblood." Augustus's face flushed with anger, his composure cracking for the first time since his arrival in Superior. "What nonsense is this?" Reverend Simmons stepped forward, producing the marriage certificate with a solemn nod. "Performed the ceremony myself last night, Mr. Whitaker. All legal and binding according to the laws of Colorado Territory." Sheriff Davis cleared his throat, his weathered face neutral as he addressed Augustus. "As I understand it, sir, your court order pertains to your niece, Ruby Whitaker. That person no longer exists, legally speaking. This here is Mrs. Ruby Youngblood, a married woman under the protection of her husband." "This is preposterous," Augustus sputtered, turning to Thorne. "You said nothing of this possibility." Thorne's lips thinned with displeasure. "A hasty marriage doesn't negate a legal guardianship, especially one established by her father's will." "Actually, it does," Sheriff Davis countered. "According to territorial law, marriage emancipates a minor from guardianship, and while Miss Whitaker pardon Mrs. Youngblood may not yet be 25, She's well past the age of consent for marriage. Augustus's eyes narrowed as he studied Ruby and Yorick, calculation replacing his momentary loss of control. Very clever, he acknowledged coldly. But this changes nothing about the inheritance waiting in Philadelphia. Your father's estate remains in trust until you reach 25, Ruby. A trust I control. By this impulsive action, you've effectively disinherited yourself. Ruby lifted her chin, meeting her uncle's gaze without flinching. Keep it, she said simply. Every penny. I want nothing from you or my father's estate if it comes with strings attached. You can't be serious, Augustus scoffed, looking genuinely baffled. You would choose poverty in this. This wilderness over your rightful place in society. Your rightful fortune. I choose love, Ruby replied, reaching for Yorick's hand. I choose freedom to determine my own path. And yes, I choose Yorick and the life we'll build together, however humble it might seem to you. Augustus's expression hardened, the mask of affability dropping completely to reveal the cold, calculating man beneath. You'll regret this decision, Ruby, when the shine wears off this. Romance, when you're struggling to make ends meet while I live comfortably on what should have been yours, you'll remember this day with bitter regret. Yorick stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. You've delivered your message, Mr. Whitaker. Now I suggest you and Mr. Thorne leave Superior on today's stage, as planned. My wife has made her choice clear. The emphasis on my wife was slight but unmistakable, a declaration of protection that made Ruby's heart swell with love and pride. For a tense moment, it seemed Augustus might continue to argue, but something in Yorick's steady gaze apparently convinced him of the futility. With a curt nod, he turned to leave, pausing at the door for one final barb. Blood tells, Ruby. You have more of your father in you than I gave you credit for the same foolish idealism that led him to ruin. I only hope you don't discover too late the cost of such naive choices. The door closed behind him with a finality that seemed to release the tension in the room. Sheriff Davis departed after confirming they would call if further assistance was needed, and Reverend Simmons followed, offering a blessing for their marriage that Ruby accepted with genuine gratitude. When only Pete remained, the old miner approached Yorick with a knowing smile. Always figured you for the type to do things your own way, boss, he chuckled. Never imagined I'd be standing witness at your wedding, though. Yorick's mouth quirked in a rare smile. Life's full of surprises, Pete. That it is, the older man agreed, nodding to Ruby. You got yourself a good man there, Mrs. Youngblood. Stubborn as a mule and about as talkative, but a good man all the same. After Pete had gone, Ruby turned to Yorick, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had transpired in less than 24 hours. Do you think they'll really leave? She asked, unable to entirely suppress the fear that had been her constant companion for so long. Your uncle strikes me as a man who calculates his battles carefully, Yorick replied, drawing her into his arms. He knows he's lost this one, whether he'll try another approach later. He shrugged. We'll face that when it comes, if it comes. Ruby rested her head against his chest, finding comfort in the steady beat of his heart. I meant what I said about the inheritance, she assured him. I don't need it. Yorick's arms tightened around her. The saloon does well enough. We won't be rich, but we won't starve either. After a moment, he added more softly, though I'd understand if someday you regret giving up so much. Ruby leaned back to look into his eyes, needing him to understand the truth of her next words. I gave up nothing that matters, she said firmly. And I gained everything I never knew I wanted. She smiled, her heart full. Besides, it seems only fitting that a man who once carried me to his table when I was too weak to stand should now carry me through life. Yorick's answering smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, rare and warming. "Speaking of carrying," he murmured, sweeping her into his arms with unexpected playfulness, "I believe we have a honeymoon to start, Mrs. Youngblood." Ruby laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck as he carried her toward the stairs. "A honeymoon in a saloon? How scandalous!" "Just the first of many adventures," Yorick promised, his eyes reflecting a future neither of them could have imagined when fate first brought them together. The years that followed proved Yorick's promise true. Their life together unfolded like the pages of a book neither could have written alone, filled with challenges and joys that shaped them both in unexpected ways. Superior grew alongside their marriage, the small mining town gradually expanding as the railroad brought increased commerce and new settlers. The Silver Dollar Saloon prospered under their joint management, Ruby's warm hospitality complementing Yorick's steady reliability. They eventually hired additional help, allowing Ruby to focus on the increasing demand for proper meals, her cooking becoming as much a draw as the quality whiskey Yorick insisted on serving. Augustus Whitaker never returned to Superior, though for several years Ruby would tense at the arrival of strangers, half expecting to see her uncle's cold gaze or Benjamin Thorne's calculating smile. In the spring of their third year of marriage, a letter arrived from Philadelphia bearing news of Augustus's death from apoplexy. The solicitor's formal words informed Ruby that, despite her uncle's threats, he had never actually altered the terms of her father's will. Upon reaching her 25th birthday the following month, she would inherit the full estate, no conditions attached. The unexpected windfall brought both opportunity and decisions. After long discussions that stretched into the night, Ruby and Yorick agreed to use a portion of the inheritance to expand their business, building a proper hotel adjacent to the saloon with clean, comfortable rooms for travelers, and a small restaurant that quickly gained reputation beyond Superior's borders. The remainder they invested wisely, creating security for their future and for the children that soon blessed their union. First came Samuel, born exactly 9 months after their wedding night, his father's quiet strength evident even in infancy. 2 years later, Eleanor joined the family, named for the woman Yorick had loved and lost, a gesture of healing that brought tears to his eyes when Ruby first suggested it. Their third child, Robert, arrived 3 years after Eleanor, completing their family with his curious nature and infectious laugh. The children grew surrounded by love and the practical education that life in a frontier town provided, learning both Ruby's refined Eastern manners and Yorick's frontier skills. As Superior transitioned from mining camp to established town, the Youngbloods became fixtures in the community. Yorick eventually accepted the position of mayor, his straightforward integrity and fair-mindedness making him a natural leader despite his initial reluctance to step into the public eye. Ruby, meanwhile, established the town's first lending library, using books purchased with her inheritance to bring literature and knowledge to a place that had once seemed so far from civilization. On the 10th anniversary of the day Yorick had found Ruby collapsed in the street, they closed the hotel and saloon for a private celebration. Friends who had been part of their journey gathered in the dining room, now elegantly appointed yet still maintaining the warmth and welcome that had characterized it from the beginning. Pete Jenkins, now stooped with age but still sharp-minded, raised his glass in a toast. "To the finest pair Superior has ever seen," he declared, his voice cracking with emotion. "And to the day our Yorick carried more than he bargained for to his table." As laughter and agreement echoed around them, Yorick's hand found Ruby's beneath the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their silent affirmation over the years. "Any regrets?" he murmured, his voice meant only for her ears. Ruby looked around at the life they had built together, their thriving business, their beautiful children, the community that had embraced them both, and then back to the man, whose quiet strength had become the cornerstone of her world. In his blue eyes, now crinkled at the corners from smiling more than he ever had before she entered his life, she saw the same love that had sustained them through every challenge and triumph. "Not one," she whispered, leaning to kiss him softly. "From hunger to happiness, from weakness to strength, you carried me then, but we've carried each other ever since. And I wouldn't change a single step of the journey." As twilight settled over Superior, painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold, the Youngblood family and their chosen family of friends continued their celebration, their laughter spilling into the street like a beacon of the joy that can grow from the most desperate beginnings. For Ruby and Yorick, the greatest adventure had not been surviving the dangers of the West or overcoming the schemes of those who would have kept them apart, but in building a life filled with the quiet miracle of everyday love, a miracle that had begun the moment a starving woman collapsed in the dust, and a lonely man found the courage to carry her not just to his table, but into his heart.